And without further ado, Translation in Life and Literature will be moderated by Bill Lavender. Bill is a poet, novelist, musician, carpenter, and publisher living in New Orleans. My ID, his 11th book of poetry, was published by Blaze Box in October 2019. It's fantastic. You'll have read it. It's so good. His novel trilogy, 3 Letters, composed of Q, little a, and private I, was released in 2021 by Sputum Duville. His verse memoir, Memory Ring, was published by Black Widow in 2011. Essays, fiction, poem-like objects, and other ephemera appear regularly in Xavier Review, Bell Swoop, Southern Review, Jacket 2, and other such print and online journals. He founded Lavender Ink, a small press mainly devoted to poetry, in 1995. And he founded Diálogos, an imprint devoted to literature and translation, in 2011. Lavender Ink Diálogos now has more than 200 books in print. And here's a fun fact that I don't think Bill knows. When I was in college, this dude named Hank Lazar was director of the honors program. And I was reading one of his books, and I was like, Lavender Ink is the coolest name for a press ever. And much later on, my dear friend Bill founded it. So yeah, I was already thinking about Bill even before we knew each other. Bill, take it away.
Okay. Can you hear me like this? Sean?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, okay. As Megan mentioned, and actually I have to say Megan is the first person who ever mentioned my imprint, Diálogos, and pronounced it correctly. Which is kind of, to the point for this this little session. At first when she asked me to do this, I was kind of confused about this concept of translation in literature and life. But I'm sort of getting into it now, and as you'll see, we've got 2 people are going to present translations, and then Kathy is going to read her fiction about a translator, so to speak. And so I was just kind of thinking about, what is it about translation? A couple of years ago at the New Orleans Poetry Festival, which I also curate, we had a panel on translation, and I was talking to another poet afterwards, and he says, well, don't you just use Google Translate and then clean it up? And my friend who has translated like 30 books said, no, that's not how you do it. And then Father Ramde, for those of you who were in here for the last session, he closed with this little rap about Google. I thought it was really appropriate to bring that up. But translation, what got me into publishing a lot of translation is that when I would get submissions of original poetry manuscripts, it would always be an agonized decision. Do I want to do this? Is it good enough? Or whatever it is that I might be thinking, will it sell? Whatever. But when the translations would come, it would be, how can I say no to this? Because they would always be world class, because what are people going to translate but the best thing they can find in that language? And so I kind of got started doing these translations, and I found that this inevitably politicized my press. Translation, it occurs to me, is always a political act. You're always delays crossing a border when you translate something. Borders of language are also political borders, and I'm going to move to my colleagues here very quickly, but I'm going to do a little bit of a shameless plug for Diálogos, and I'm going to just read you one little bit of a translation of this poet, Abdelatif Labi, of whom I've published 3 books now, and I've also published his wife's memoir. Labi is a Moroccan poet. He founded this magazine called Soufflé back in the, I believe it was the early 80s. It was an extremely political magazine that didn't mind using literature to criticize the authoritarian government in Morocco at the time, and for his efforts there, he was imprisoned for almost a decade, tortured and subjected to all kinds of horrors. And as is often the case in North Africa, he had to immigrate to France to find basically a place to live. He was francophone, he was writing in French. And there, his reputation sort of solidified, and now he's considered to be Morocco's greatest living poet after having survived their prisons. Anyway, I have several books of his for sale on the website, and I'm just going to read this one because I think it kind of, you'll hear his history in it, and it also just kind of gets to the heart of the issue. It's called The Banner of Hate in English. It's translated by Peter Thompson. Translated from the French, The Banner of Hate. The flick of the sower's hand, the poet's pen, suspended the masked face of the head lopper. Ruins of Palmyra and barbarous night, what tale have you for the stars? All flags are somewhat ridiculous, but that famous one, black, standing out on white with a scrap of calligraphy that says God is the envoy of the prophet, that flag is just plain hideous. We can certainly credit those who wave it with inventing the banner of hatred. For them, what is the greatest good? Absolute evil, obviously. What use is God to them? At most, just to slime their tongues. Do they look their victims in the eyes? No more than you look a lamb, rooster, or pig in the eyes as you slit its throat and bleed it. Do they love their own children? There's the rub. Yes, they love them. So, how do you become a monster? The moment you commit your first monstrous act. A little bread, a little water, and between 2 calls to prayer, that day's massacre. From under the ruins, cries, children's pleas have dried up. Just another day, 100, 200 fewer souls. And there'll always be some asshole to observe. Life goes on. So, how do you guys want to do? Do you want to just go down the line? Or do you have any preference?
Just go down the line.
Okay. This gentleman to my left here is Chris Romaguera. He's a Cuban-American writer born and raised in Florida. He holds degrees in English and philosophy from Florida International and an MFA from University of New Orleans. His work has appeared in the Daily Beast, Curb National, Pank, New Orleans Review, Santa Fe Writers Project, and lots of other places. He's a monthly columnist for Plowshares, and he's currently fiction editor at New Southern Fugitives and editorial intern at Electric Literature. He's going to read from a book he is translating called Charas by the Mexican novelist Hernan Larrazabala. The book concerns the 1974 abduction and murder of a student leader known as Charas in the Yucatan. The account presents real newspaper articles and interviews about the case interwoven with the author's recreation of developing drama to ferret out the truth behind the political homicide. And I'll turn it over to you. Continue the intro.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you all. Sound check, can you all hear me? Yeah. Sneaky suspicion. I'm also going to stand because I love dramatic flair. So this will be my first reading of this manuscript in public that is graciously being published by UNO Press. At one point I saw Abram walking here, but I cannot dare you. That's the silhouette. Slated for next year. And I guess the only background I think is needed for this is that this is a chapter from early in the novel, a second person perspective from one of the soon-to-be kidnappers. The chapter title is called You. Monday, February 11th, 1974, 9:27 a.m. When you wake up, the first thing you see is the long brown hair of the cowgirl, last night's lover, who slept soundly with her mouth open, breathing heavily. Her right knee up all the way to her breast, her small cotton robe rising, revealing the curve of her hip. You take a cigarette from the table next to the bed and light it. Then you lean back against the cold wall. Since you had managed to make some money last night, you decide to go to marry her. You haven't been back in almost 3 weeks. You have cotton mouth. Your left temple hurts. You don't know if the pain was from too much rum or too much pot. They say weed doesn't give a hangover, but every time you smoke it, you wake up with a headache. Who knows? Maybe you'll pass. You grab your glass that holds the rest of last night's beer and you take a swig. It is warm, bitter, flat, so you spit it out. You get up naked and walk to the bathroom. You stop in front of the mirror, touch your cheeks. You have a 2-day-old shadow of a beard. You thought about whether to shave now or once you were in Merida, better in town after you finish the drive and shower. You put on your pants. You start to get ready. You wash your hands and face. You wet your hair. You take out your comb from your back pocket, brush a little. You reach into your pockets and take out your money. You start to count. Just a little over 3,000 pesos in crumpled up bills. It is what you had left from yesterday's operation. Damn, you had spent almost half of it in one night. You took 200 pesos and left it on the cowgirl's table. You crossed the bar with the chairs all upside down on the tables, smelling the ash from dead cigarettes, the liquor from spilled drinks, the piss that escaped the urinals. You go out into the street, then walk into your hotel room at the Hotel Cameron, which is not far from the brothel where you had just spent the night. You put some clothes in your briefcase. You go to Doña Toya's room and call her. She rushes out, as usual, in a bad mood. Are you going to pay me now? She asks. How much do I owe you again? You respond. Let's see, she says as she looks at her receipts. It's been 25 days at 60 pesos a day, so 1,500. 11:14 a.m. You flag down a taxi and go to the market, where you have a shrimp cocktail and a beer. Then you go to the bus station. You ask the clerk when the next bus to Merida is. She tells you 20 minutes. You wait in a sleepy haze from the night before on one of their benches before you hear that your bus is about to leave. You sleep the whole ride through. You feel weak, tired. In the window seat next to you, a young woman sits. In your haze, your head bobs up and down and bumps into her shoulder over and over again. When the bus arrives at the Calkini stop, several seats become vacant and she scurries off and takes one of them. You smile at your good fortune and rest your head on the now open window seat as you fall back asleep. 3:30 p.m. Yesterday, Comandante Chan Lopez came by looking for you, says your woman, 8 months pregnant, right as you enter your house in your old neighborhood of Dolores Otero. How did it go? Good. Where's our daughter? She shouldn't be long. She's with the neighbors. You said Chan came by? He told me he wanted to buy you a drink. He asked when you were coming back. I told him I never know with you. He then just laughed and told me to tell you he came by. Your daughter enters the house and immediately runs into your arms for a hug. You sit on her lap and ask your woman what she has made for lunch. You chat with your little girl as your woman tells you that there's nothing in the house besides eggs and beans and your pregnant, penniless wife. You have 1,000 pesos. You give her 1,000 pesos. She looks at you even more embarrassed than before she had your money. So you did well on your commission? Be careful of that, because who knows how long that will need to last. 5 p.m. After you all eat, you take a siesta, then shower and shave, before going out to look for Comandante Chan Lopez. Who knew why, but Comandante had taken note of you since you had first met, back when your father had just died. Your poor pops, he had worked like a mule all his life, and for what? Don Ruben Maso had paid him pennies. When the old man died, they stayed in the ghetto, until Don Emilio Sejo started to help your mother, in order to make it all work out. He then gave a pension, though even that barely made a dent. It was then that you decided to work, no matter what the job was. So you joined the police force and started your cadet training. You had barely been there for a week when Comandante Chan Lopez fixed his eyes on you. You with the sideburns, come here. And just like that, you went from a vile cadet, a good-for-nothing, a perfect candidate to join a gang or be a pawn for a crime boss, to becoming a member of the State Highway Patrol. It was even more surprising considering you had never driven before, essentially learning how to drive and be police at the same time. It is there, working with Comandante Chan Lopez, where you learned about Yerba, about Bolita, and exactly what the grass and women meant to these men of power. Sometimes you had to guard the politicians that came from the FN. You'd accompany them to their first meetings, then to their meetings. Many, many times they picked you up at night, you had to sleep, and then they'd take you on some mission to seize some pot or shut down some brothel that didn't want to cooperate. Of course, this was until you had the accident. You had barely slept the night before. You and your comrades, together with Comandante Chan, had been partying almost all night in Mérida, doing the opposite of seizing pot or shutting down brothels. In the heat of the moment, between drinks and jokes and flirting with pretty girls, Chan touched you. At first, you didn't care. It was a touch. But then you noticed what was happening. So you shot up from the table, pissed off, and went out into the street, into your police car, blasting down the road. You didn't know what to do, where to go. You were drunk. You were very drunk. Without knowing where you were going, you stopped at a bypass and fell asleep in your patrol car. When you woke up again, it was past 11 in the morning, and you felt like vomiting. Still dizzy, you found yourself in the middle of the road, a road unknown to you, without a clue as to what you were doing there. The memory of what happened the night before slowly came back to you. And just like that, you were pissed off all over again. You decided to head back to Mérida, to head back to your station. You drove with so much focus, so much force, so much speed. But the speed and force lasted longer than the focus, and you crashed into the back of a freight truck that was parked in the corner. The truck lost its bumper, you lost your car. If you hadn't been so drunk, you could have gotten away with it. You could have vanished and they could have covered for you, saying you were on official police business. But the truck driver was with other people, and all of them were more sober, were more right of mind than you. You were able to make up with the driver quickly once you realized there was nothing he could do to you, as you flexed your newfound police muscle, showing what wearing that uniform made you impervious to. So the driver accepted your offer to owe him a favor. Of course, the one you couldn't square things with was Comandante Chan Lopez, who had said you had to pay the repairs for the total police car within the day, or he'd have you thrown in jail. So with the Comandante having turned on you, despite the fact that he had set the whole incident in motion with his own actions, you decided to burn it all to the ground. You decided never to return to work, and you went back home to Merida, then took refuge in Campeche with some of your friends who you'd met on the raids. After having returned to Merida, you realized that no one was following you, no one was chasing you, there was no warrant out for your arrest, so you decided to reach out for the Comandante Chan Lopez again. It was March 1972. "I've come to ask for your forgiveness," you told Comandante Chan, "and not just for the car, but for disrespecting you." Comandante Lopez smiled. "Can you accept my apology that it won't ever happen again, mi Comanche?" you asked. The Comandante raised his finger. "Look, the fact of the matter is that I am over the car, but what I can't forgive is you questioning my manhood," the Comandante said, "because I am as much macho as you, even more so than you, and I'll show you whenever you want, right here or on the street, with women, with the bottle, with blows, or even with a gun if you really want to." I know, Comandante. That's why I came to apologize." "Good, cabron. Then let's let it die here. But don't you dare put any more of that flamenco on me. Because if you do, I'm not going to throw you in jail, but I'm going to fuck you up in ways that you'll never forget for the rest of your life." "You accept me coming back again, Comandante, on my knees." He accepts you in. You worked there for another 4 months. You established contacts with the yerba growers, the makeshift casinos, the brothels. You came back more popular in the area, in Merida and in Campeche. This worked well, until the Comandante found out what you were doing and realized he wasn't getting his cut. Since you had already made enough money, you decided to burn it all down again, but this time in a much calmer way. You asked for your resignation again, and they discharged you once again. You went to Chetumal. There, you had contacts. You started to skim cash once again, but you quickly realized it wasn't the same doing business as a citizen as it was under the protection of the badge. You teamed up with a cousin of yours and decided to open a fruit stand business in Veracruz. Your cousin gave you the money for a car hitch, and together you set up a stall for the market. This did not go very well. You started to make a little more on the side. You were the one scratching everyone's back. But then came the problems between you and your cousin. Money problems, of course. So the relationship started to crack. And it finished cracking when the cousin got suckered like an idiot, and you took back the car after he couldn't repay you. In November 1973, you decided to go back to Merida. Without a job, you decided to head back to La Zona de Tolerancia, the red light district of Mexico in the 70s, of Campeche, where you had little friends and even less acquaintances. You got reconnected, which is where you fell in love with the cowgirl. You managed to get a spot on the market, and you earned good cash that you had already burned through on all-nighters, partying, and then giving the rest to the cowgirl for spending. Which is why you have once again decided to meet up with Chan. 7:52 p.m. "Would you like to return to the force?" Chan asks, with a smile the second you enter. "Of course, mi Comanche. I need the job. Let me talk to Captain Marufo and Colonel Gamboa," Chan says, before getting up from his chair. 8:30 p.m. "Yeah, you're back. You're with us again. Comandante Cicero is coming back to raise your ranks once again. Enrique Cicero Salazar gives you your re-entry application once again, and he removes your old files from the archive once again. Marufo asks you to stay at the station because he wants you to participate in a mission tonight. We are looking for a plane that is said to be heading to Chicú. We need cabrones like you, not pendejitos who couldn't even tell you who farted. 10 p.m. You go out there with your compadres. You go out there in 2 cars, armed with pistols and machine guns. Down the road to Progreso, Marufo directs the operation. Chan serves as a second in command. They both look calm, while everyone else looks nervous. You first go to Chicú, Puerto, then into the gaps, then through several beaches. Nothing. Everything seems to be in order and at peace. From there, you head to Guaymatú, the dense beaches of coconut palms, then into the sea. Nothing. Not a light, not a movement, everything calm. You go to San Benito, to San Bruno, to Champu, and then finally to Telchac, Puerto. Nothing. Tuesday morning, 1 a.m. You all return to Merida. You find the city completely calm. Chan Lopez, contrary to his usual custom, takes you to your home in one of his cars. Come to the office tomorrow around 5 in the afternoon, he tells you. I have a special mission for you. With a pregnant wife at home, how can you say no to easy money? How can you say no to money for nothing? Thank you.
Next, we're going to hear from Ariel Francisco, who was born in the Bronx to Dominican and Guatemalan parents and raised in Miami, where he completed his MFA in poetry at Florida International. He also holds an MFA in literary translation from Queens College, CUNY. He's the author of, this is my favorite title of the poetry book ever, Under Capitalism, If Your Head Aches, They Just Yank Off Your Head. And several other books, including All My Heroes Are Broke from CNR Press, which was named one of the 8 best Latino books of 2017. His work has appeared in the New Yorker podcast, Academy of American Poets Poem a Day, Rumpus, American Poetry Review, and elsewhere. He is the translator of Colombian poet Carolina Sanchez's Viaje, or Voyage, and Guatemalan poet Ariel Lopez, Routines, Goodbyes, from Spike and Doggle. He's an assistant professor of poetry at Louisiana State University, recently hired, so he's not yet cynical. He'll be reading from his translations of Haitian Dominican poet and revolutionary fighter Jacques Renaud, who wrote during the rise of another US-backed dictatorship in the wake of the terror of the Trujillo era. Renaud's verse channels the natural beauty of this country to inspire resistance. Asymptote, in publication of a selection of these poems, says Francisco's superb translation sublimates the visceral and sometimes violent imagery of these poems into an enduring love in the speaker's voice, a testament to Renaud, who celebrated his homeland's fragile democracy and honored those who defended Ariel.
All right, thank you for that, Bill. I didn't realize you were pressmates with the Spooky Dialogue too.
Yeah.
That's a cool connection. Thank you for having me, and thank you all for coming out. Can you guys hear me okay without it?
Yep.
All right, I'm going to read from my phone like a good little millennial. But briefly, Jacques Renaud, he was born in Haiti in, I think, 1942, and immigrated to the Dominican Republic when he was about 8. His father was a school teacher, and he had to go into exile for some kind of political turmoil going on there at the time. And he was killed during the revolution in 1965 when he was just 23 years old. So he writes a lot about, in Spanish you say la patria, which means the homeland in English. But when he says la patria, he means the island as a whole. He's not talking about either Haiti or the Dominican Republic as individual countries, but really the whole island. So that's kind of a recurring theme in his work. And the particular tragedy is the history of violence from the Dominican Republic towards Haiti. And this person in particular growing up and quite literally fighting and dying for Dominican independence. So dying for a country that really didn't care about him at all. And so his work, it talks a lot about that. But then you can kind of see the escalation of the realization that writing didn't suffice anymore. So he was a poet, not just a poet revolutionary in his aesthetics, but quite literally he put down the pen and took up arms to defend his dialogue. And was killed in 1965 after Trujillo, the Dominican Republic elected their first actual president, their first actual democratic elections, a guy named Juan Bosch, who was a leftist, so of course the US came in and there was a coup, and then there was a revolution, about a couple thousand revolutionaries, but the US sent about 40,000 troops to crush it pretty quickly. They were very scared, like another Cuba is the justification that they gave at the time. So that's just a little background information. So I'll just read 3 poems for you guys. And I don't often read from his work, so forgive me if I stumble a little bit, because it is kind of strange. I guess we'll get into that later, but the strangeness of reading somebody else's work, even though it's coming from you. So if I make any mistakes, that's part of the translation process. This first one is called Man Awakens. Man awakens, sowing the assassinated seed, hope curdling in a cry. Light escapes his hands. The washer's stream throws its loud laughter, rinsing in the trees, tightening the earth, possessing it, leaving the eternal seed in the roots, injecting the spirited youth, unearthing the buried love, all the tightened silences in the streets of my homeland, raised by hunger, assaulted by thieves, led towards the banks in fragments where pieces of ship in disguise monopolize the lilies and bread. Man of my homeland, wanderer, traveler, fatigued vertebrae of the Antilles, here I give my hand to serve as a bridge between our cries, for you to rest your head, place your heart on the sores, and listen silently how it dawns, how the birds squawk, how the river of lavender sings, fighting, opening a furrow to pour our blood, and maybe, who knows, our lives. Man of every street, of dawn, towering heaps of failure, statue of my homeland, sculpted from the deep roots of night. Take my hand, and we'll listen together how the river of lavender awakens to sing, and the broken shouts announce the light. And that's another kind of theme that comes up in his work a lot, just this use of like the word man. That's like a very kind of Whitman-esque, right, that large kind of voice that he tries to summon in his work. This one's called We Take Refuge. We take refuge in the wounded word's shadow, flowing from your sore like a healing sap. We made from ourselves this mutilated life and learned to move the earth, searching for the roots of love. Evening arrives slowly, while cicadas prelude the coming night, tiny stars extinguish in the grass, illuminating your arrival. Only hearts that cling to the earth stand over silence, are nourished from fatigue, and speak following the wind of your arriving life. Through the streets wandered our gone gaze. Some trembling heart senses us. We fled from the life offered us from those hands and eyes and words without leaving any footprints. Nocturnal silk spinners obscure our memories. They want nothing else from us but our voices. Man, here is your trail. Woman, here is the mirror possessing your face. Courageous youth, poor child, who left no life on this earth. It doesn't matter. I declare myself your son, and in your name I'll raise my voice, and in my name you guard the silence. I will prolong your shout and your stare. You won't be forgotten, because in your name I will be crying, smiling, until my blood flows from the wounded word that will adopt your name. We take refuge in the distracted in the distracted shadows of trees, and from them we run towards this mutilated life. We moved the earth and found the roots of love, ingrained deeply in the hearts of our dead. And just one more. And I think this last one was kind of very definitive of his work. It was called My Homeland Arose. My homeland arose from this morning life, like a lone earthen breeze in the wastelands. Dry air of the mountains caresses our faces with the aroma of death, while hunger walks the path of man. The dry earth split. A hostile sky slings towards the sun and the clouds. Nothing falls. The leaves on the trees abandon their green, going on naked, leaving the agonized trees to die. The rivers become lethargic and tired. The birds flee from dust exhaled by the earth, from aluminum and gold, from long hungers and winding thirst. Like this, my homeland emerged from this morning life, with frayed pages and uncertain steps, like the dead bursting from their tomb, distributing lots of silence to the landless peasants sweating from anguish. Life was doling out agony. Man roams like a cactus in the wasteland, solitude opening paths in the scarce grass and abundant rocks. Dust drowned the howling and smothered the sores under the sun and sky of this massacred land. Thank you.
Okay, and last reading before questions. Kathy Ramsperger has written stories, poetry, and novels since she won her first award at the age of 16. She's a graduate of Hollins University in Roanoke. She studied under several esteemed writers, including Eudora Welty. Her mentor, Richard Henry Wilde, Dillard, and poet Henry Taylor. She holds a graduate degree from George Washington University, and she reviews multicultural and international books for the New York Journal of Books. Most recently, she's written 2 sequential novels. They are The Shores of Our Souls and 1,000 Flying Things. And today, she's going to be reading from the latter. She's not reading the translation, she's reading her own original work, but I think you'll see that it kind of continues the theme that we've got going here, because it's the character is a translator, so to speak. Am I right there?
I'm a little bit more soft-spoken, and I'd really like to stand so I can use my diaphragm to project. But I'm gonna have this mic in front of me. I usually don't like mics in front of me because it blocks me from you guys, but can you hear me okay? Am I projecting enough?
Yes.
Okay,
Those mics are picking up very, very well.
so maybe I should put it back there.
No, you're
You're
good.
okay.
You're good.
I think you're okay. Just-
All right, so, thank you, Bill, for that gracious introduction. I'm honored to be here with these translators. I don't consider myself a translator, but I was responsible for 50 publications when I worked overseas that were written in 4 languages: English, French, Spanish, and Arabic. I never touched the Arabic. I did have final approval on the translated French and English. So I'm a journalist, I'm a humanitarian for 25 years, International Red Cross and Red Crescent, and I'm a coach. And this is what I've learned about translation, and I'm a little older than most people, and so if you live long enough, you learn. Everything is a translation. Every breath we take, every word we say is a translation. We take our history and our culture with us as we live and as we read. We can't impose our culture or opinion onto a translation. That means we have to walk in another person's shoes as well as we can, maintain our relative objectivity as much as we can, and have radical empathy for the other person that we're communicating to, that we're writing about as a character, and we have to be good listeners to do that. So we won't interpret what we're writing, those little coded scribbles on the page, like somebody who is reading those little scribbled codes on a page will interpret it for themselves. The bad news about this in communication, there could be a communication breakdown. Misinterpretation can lead to anything from a small conflict with a friend to world wars. And so it's important to be careful with our words. And the good news, because I want to end this with good news, and then I'll read. People take our stories, and remember, you all have a story, and they make them their own as they read them. So, my first reading is going to be from 1,000 Flying Things, which is a standalone sequel to The Shores of Our Souls. What I need you to know about The Shores of Our Souls is that it's about two protagonists who couldn't be more different in terms of age, in terms of economic status, in terms of religion, in terms of cultural belief. And they meet under a disco ball in New York City one night, and they fall in love despite themselves. And they're 10 years. They don't make it from this first novel. I'm sorry for any spoilers there. But who knows whether they'll make it in the second novel, because they've catalyzed each other through their words, through their actions, through their secrets to change and transform. So Diana, who used to be a museum researcher, is now in southern Sudan in a displaced persons camp, trying to teach reading to boys who are being trained as child soldiers, and the book she is sent is in English. (1991). Today, Diane is reading from the Jungle Book, but none of them are listening. The few boys in front of her are exhausted before the day begins from yesterday's hard work and training. They probably have little time in their day for fantasy stories with talking tigers and snakes. Nothing like their lives. Mowgli is Indian, and the story is implausible and sometimes racist. A colonialist wrote it over 100 years ago. She sees Thon sneer each time she reads the label, man cub. She should have thought to call him Mowgli. 20 years ago, when she was about Thon's age, Diana fell in love with this novel because of its foreignness, its animals, and its message. But it is not what she should be reading aloud here. This book was written a long time ago, she tries to explain, and it's about a jungle not southern Sudan. Men are not animals, Thon answers, picking at his front tooth with a blade of grain. After class, the boys play football with an ancient deflated soccer ball. She brings her old Polaroid out. The boys drop their football and race towards the contraption, a camera from her past, but an object these boys have never seen. The resulting yellow, blurred images create quite a stir in this little camp. The children love to see themselves. They delight in making faces for the camera. They even print sometimes, hoping she will choose to snap one of them. It is more than a conversation starter. It is a showstopper, marketing her words with their pictures. Yet would words ever mean as much to these boys as they did to Diana? Would they lay down their rifles to turn the pages of the books she provided? Her mind pushes against the languid heat that presses her into the earth, and her lungs try to take in more air. The smell of overused cooking oil, reminiscent of the many meals fried in it, cuts the air like a scythe. She longs for just one ice cube. That is when she sees a young boy's hand. The hand waves at her from behind a large rock. Flat on top, nature's idea of a throne, the stone hides the rest of a child's body. The hand itself, though, is a work of art. It is a hand a hyena could tear off with one swift chomp. Tiny, ragged fingernails, dirt caked over hidden fingerprints, flies buzzing this way, that way. The wrist is another thing altogether, smooth and shiny and strong. She takes up her Polaroid and begins to snap. The shutter clicks and the photos whirl out until all the film is gone. They fall at her feet, creating a small dust storm. Hello? She wonders if she understands even that simple greeting. Hey, he answers. Her eyes go wide. How does he know that word? Most boys know hi or hello, but seldom use them because she greets them in their own language. And this boy looks barely old enough to speak many words at all. I teach myself book. The boy smiles. You help? Do you speak English? Diana fumbles in a mixture of English, Arabic, and Dinka. The little boy smiles again, attempting to mimic her sounds. Then he slaps her hand with his, reaches into her pocket, finds an English tea biscuit, and pops it in his mouth. Tank. Diana laughs at the mispronunciation, wondering how long it took him to learn the sentence he greeted her with. Her heart is in her ears. She may have found her student. So another thing I write about is the tribal leader in this camp. Diana suspects that he might be training this little boy as a child soldier. Things are not as they seem. She has a little bit of white savior in her. And Beale sends her on a fool's mission, and she contracts malaria and has to go to Nairobi, which she runs into Kasim there. But Beale is doing this. He's acting this way because he's trying to protect his people. So this is when she comes back to camp. Her hut, her dwelling has been destroyed and torn through. I was only away because of you. Diana's breath comes out hot, enunciating every word. I did not make you ill, Miss Calloway. She wants to pummel his chest, rant, shout. You had something to do with it, and you know it. How could I, a healthy man, make you ill? And why would I destroy your little souvenirs? Beale's lip turns up a millimeter. They stare each other down. Why are you here? He says at last. You may have no more use for me here, but I wanted to be able to see you in person. I also came to claim my belongings, but this box is all that I have left. She holds the box, which Kasim gave her, up for his inspection. She would have shoved it in his face, but she doesn't want him to touch it. Destroy one of the last things that means anything to her, like he destroyed her other belongings, like he destroyed her heart by separating her from Khalil's little boy. Damascene, he mutters. Yes, she says, it was a gift that I treasured. Yes, he says, I have lost many treasures, my son for one. Diana's throat closes over. I am sorry, I didn't know. It was a long time ago, he says, and starts to read the map again. The box and his confession hang in the air between them until she asks about the Arabic phrase the box holds. I was wondering if you could translate this for me. You read a little Arabic? Yes, I know Arabic, he says. What is it? Let me see. He holds it up to his lantern. He looks at the paper, unfolds it. He rubs his chin and grunts. Where did you find this? It's mine, she says, not willing to budge, from many years ago. What does it say? I should hope so, Beale says, with his slow, sly grace. You understand the Arabic language is the language of words to build upon one another, he questions. Diana does not know this fact, but she nods her head anyway. Not just a word, but a set of consonants that start as one word, then add 3 more and a vowel, and it becomes another, and so on. Diana's beginning to understand. You've heard that Eskimos have a certain number of words for snow. and that Egyptians have a certain number of words for sand. Language invents many words for things it has a plenitude of. Diana furrows her brow. She's afraid he's lost her. What did snow and sand have to do with what's on the paper he holds? Why can't he just give her the direct translation, for God's sake? This man despises her as much as she does him. He's taking his time because he's toying with her. His eyes pierce through her. Arabic has many words for love. Foolish of her to give it to him to translate. She snatches the piece of paper and turns to go, her shoes crunching beneath her on the dirt floor. Miss Calloway, he calls after her. Don't you want to know which one it was? So if we've got time, I have one more that's shortest. Okay. Like I said, everything in life is a translation and an interpretation. And this is when Kasim and Diana realize that. It's the moment that they both realize that, and that there's a chance for the love that they have for each other. I still have your letters and your poem, Kasim says. And by the way, this is months, not years later. They're in New York. She thinks she may weep again, but she doesn't. How could she have her letters and yet never respond to her last one? How could he have her letters? She decides not to pursue this question with him now. Instead, she moves toward him and caresses the box he'd given her a decade ago. I saw the lining was ripped. His voice falters. Yes. How did that happen? He's trying to sound nonchalant. They tore my belongings apart in Sudan. Oh, he answers. She can hear his disappointment. Kasim, my dear Kasim, she says, I found it. You did? He looks genuinely happy, like when she greeted him this evening, but more relaxed, at peace. Come, he pulls her toward the living room. The morning after we met, he says, I have this memory, you see, which is unforgiving. You say that, but what do you remember? You were sitting in my winged-back chair. Your left leg was tucked under you. The clock said 10:03 a.m. You had on my robe. The sunlight hit you, your long, thick hair on your left shoulder. You were so, so beautiful. She remembers it now, almost as he does, but she has not carried it around with her as he has, or remembered herself as beautiful. She can't speak. I'm sorry I could never be there for you, he says. Don't say anything, he says, when she opens her mouth to convey her forgiveness. Open the gift. Her eyes never leave his face as she tears at the ribbon, the curly toe. Open it, he says with more urgency. She takes the lid from the box inside. There's another container. Do you know where this box comes from, he says? He's always tested her. She's not sure if he believes she speaks French. It's ceramic, Limoges, très bien. It is porcelain, painted a gilded gold. She picks it up and holds it to the light. Inside are 2 pieces of curled paper, the kind found in Chinese fortune cookies. The first one says, love is like playing the piano. First you must learn to play by the rules. Then you must forget the rules and play from the heart. That was my fortune cookie the night we met, he says. You kept it. Her heart beats against every rib in her chest. She unrolls the second one, the one she found in Beale's camp. After he reads the sentence several times, she puts her head on his chest, feels the beat in her ear. Which kind of love does it say you have? The kind that nestles in the chambers of the heart, he says. But you know, my dear, that is not the only word I have held in my heart when I have thought of you and our short time together, a short time that will last forever. I have a kind of love for you too, she says, that there is no word for it in English. Such a limited language, he teases, then grows serious. And that word would be, and you'll have to redefine that. Thank you so much.
Okay, we got a few minutes left for questions. Anybody want to ask any of our readers about the work? Or
I'm always interested in places where there is something that cannot be translated, where there is, for example, like if Arabic has many words for love and English has few, the ones that don't have easy correspondence, not that there's, where there even be about faithfulness and translation and not anything like that. But are there places that you think about in the pieces that you read today where you decided consciously to retain some foreignness and untranslatability, or something that you're particularly proud of pulling into English, or something that you think about, that one didn't quite work right?
Sure. That's a good question. I think it's a little tricky because I don't quite believe that there's nothing that can't be translated, and in my own practice, I very deliberately seek out poetry that I feel some kind of kinship to, so that I can solve those translation problems with my own poetic techniques. Like I couldn't translate, one of my favorites, Lorca, for example, just because he writes so differently than I do, that even reading him in English, I sometimes don't understand what he's saying. And so to do that myself, I wouldn't quite be able to, that sort of surrealist kind of approach to it. But I think one thing that I suppose I'm proud of is that I don't put too much of my own voice into the translation. Like, even though Jacques Villeray, he prioritizes this very natural imagery and his use of metaphor, but his poetry doesn't read like my own poetry. So no one would read his translations, or even hear me read my translations of his work and mistake it for my own work. So I don't know if that quite answers the question, but I think that's something that I am happy, because I have had translations where I'm like, wait, it just sounds like me. That's me would be a semi-bad translation, or some translators that I greatly admire, like Robert Bly, but sometimes you read Robert Bly's translation and you're like, this sounds like you though, right? Like something, that might be putting too much of the self into it sometimes. Yeah.
Lorca's a great example too, because he's been translated so many different times.
Yeah.
There's so many different versions, and they're all oddly different.
Yeah. It's really nutty. And then even Naruto also just.
Yeah, right.
I'm gonna copy a lot of what you said because you're smart. But no, I mean, I think I had a similar, in some ways struggle, but in some ways it was beneficial to me in that for the novel I was translating, it's written in the 90s, set in the 70s in the peninsula of Mexico, and there's few, besides maybe like the literal King of Spain Spanish, that's going to be more different than the Cuban American Miami Spanish I grew up speaking. And so if at any point it sounded like Manuel was doing it wrong, and so it was a challenge because it was very different Spanish and very different slang, and because the novel changes POVs every chapter, so it's 17 different characters, and it's newspaper clippings and just different styles of writing in of itself. So it kept me honest, but it also was like trying to keep all those voices in my head was both challenging but also helpful, because I knew that if it started sounding like me, I wasn't translating it enough.
Yeah.
There were a couple places where you chose to retain the Spanish.
Okay.
I'm sort of interested in those poems too.
Yeah, I mean, that, hopefully that's not where I'm failing too much to sounding like me, because I did grow up in Miami and we do speak two languages at all times, for better and for worse, yeah. Yeah, I mean, the one word that I think I've been able to sound maybe the smartest in my head about it is in dialogue. I have really just enjoyed keeping ya because while it essentially means like already enough or what have you, it's also just kind of like a grunt. And I think the grunt aspects of it in dialogue was good as a placeholder for how they were speaking. And I thought it was enough that most people who are reading it are going to be able to pick up on what it means without having to say like the word itself. So there was a lot of times, and I did catch actually in this chapter a couple times where I kept it just because, you know, it just seemed to fit the placeholder. Like the dialogue would be changing, not that we're speaking in, you know, not that any of these characters are speaking iambic pentameter, but to keep it as true to the rhythm as possible. Yeah,
It's almost like a
yeah, a little bit, you know.
Verbal gesture or the natural word.
Yeah, you know.
You also have that problem. You have to.
Oh yeah, but yeah, I wasn't changing color. But the Chili Peppers can turn a song into it. I feel like I'm allowed to keep it. Yeah. I hope that was helpful.
And when I was editing translations, I was looking for nuance. Especially when you have a magazine and you've got a bunch of journalists contributing, and then it's translated, it can be translated too literally. And so I would make sure, again, I didn't do the Ariel, but in the English and the French and the Spanish versions, the nuance was there, even if it wasn't an exact translatable word. But I defer to these gentlemen because I am not as fluent. I didn't grow up in Spanish or French. I learned it as a second and third language. So I would never have translated myself. But I found, in journalism at least, it was really important to keep the nuance of the language there. For the French people reading it, for Francophones and the people who speak Spanish. Because if the nuance wasn't there, it didn't matter. It was a direct translation. It wasn't coherent.
Yeah, I remember in Madrid once reading, really proud of myself that I could read an article. It was like an editorial in one of the political newspapers there. And, but when I got to the end of it, I suddenly realized, though I knew every word, I didn't know what side the guy was on. I really couldn't figure it out. You know? It was like a little subtle, those little sarcasms and sort of, you know, double negatives and things like that were part and parcel of conversational Spanish, completely beyond me and beyond like just the lexical meaning of the words. You know? And I found, you know, it's interesting. I was fascinated by your reading from the novel, that section where she's reading Rudyard Kipling to the, as a way of teaching them English, which, you know, is just like the epitome of the colonial stance. It was exactly the opposite of what you guys are talking about, trying to be as faithful to the original as possible, whereas Kipling wants to just put his own voice into, like, even such foreign things as animals, you know.
That happens all the time.
Yeah.
Still, but definitely in Rudyard Kipling's time.
Oh yeah, so certainly in Kipling's time. I mean,
Because everything was their perspective. Like,
Yeah.
it was Kipling's perspective.
I mean, they called it the King's English because it was the mechanism of conquest. You know, I mean, it's Britain's world of conquest. It's why airplane pilots converse in English today. You know, all over the world. You know.
And you get the winter coats along with English books.
Yeah.
And
Right.
beg,
Yeah. No.
beg for something in that language. There's one other thing. It's my perspective, having lived in Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Africa, traveled through the Middle East, that we just do not have enough international books in this country. You go in any bookstore, in any other country, in any other city, and you will see many, many, many different authors represented in many different languages. And we need more of that in this country. Not just from Americans, but from people all over the world, because we're hungry for it as a nation. We want to know what's happening. At least I do. And it's sparse. It's sparse.
Yeah, it's true. In the European bookstores, I mean, any given bookstore could have a Spanish, French, English, German language section, but trying to find even a Spanish language book in the Barnes and Noble.
But we don't read.
Yeah.
I mean, as a country, I have students who never read books.
Yeah. Well, did you have a question?
You want to go?
Oh, you go.
Well, I'm a translator, and I translate from Portuguese, and one of the guys I translate, I know him personally, so I can call him and say, what did you mean by this, Jacinto, which helps. Also, you have a similar sensibility, but to translate a dead author, well, Javier, I wanted to ask you, my wife is a Dominicana, and when you spoke about Patria, that island, which is amazing, those two countries are on the same island, and he speaks of it in a holistic way. I'm wondering how he approaches that intellectually and emotionally through his poetry. I mean, I heard some of it there, but I never heard that used to coalesce both cultures like that, because it seems to be a conflict within the island.
Sure. Yeah, well, I should say my dad is also a poet. My dad is the Dominican side of my family, and so I started with translating his poetry. So very similarly, I could just text and be like, what the hell is this mean? But he gave me this book by Jacques Villeray when I started my program at Queens College. He just sent me a bunch of Dominican authors so that I could figure out what I wanted to work on. And my dad, he's not an academic, and he doesn't have a book published or anything like that, but he's the biggest Latin American literature nerd that you could ever encounter. I think Chris can vouch to that. And so when I had questions about View's work, I could ask my dad, because he's very familiar not just with literature, but with the history of his country. So he knew all about the revolution and those sorts of things. There are a few poems, I didn't read them, but there's a word which I think has recently been debunked, but for a long time, this word, Quiscaya, which was alleged to be the indigenous Taino name for the island. He uses that a lot in his workshop to refer to the island. I think very recently it's been discovered that that's not actually the actual indigenous word, but at the time he would have thought it was. But he was also very young. I mean, he was killed when he was 23, so a lot of these poems are written at 22, 21. So I think it might be more audacity than anything else to try to bridge, the gap between the two countries. But also, again, he was Haitian, immigrated when he was a child, so he would have, quite literally been a person of both countries. And again, just quite literally taking up arms to defend his adopted homeland. His work, the book is coming out next year. It's called Poet of One Island with Get Fresh Books. The pre-order actually just went up today, which is pretty exciting. But you can see quite literally the progression of his work. He talks in support of the revolutionaries, and he's trying to reconcile this violence. And then quite literally, he gets killed. He gets to put down the pen and take up arms. So I don't know how much I can speak to the emotional aspect of it. In Spanish, there's a collected works of his, and there are some interviews with people who knew him and his friends. He was the youngest person in his kind of group of writers, and he was this kind of quieter guy, right? But he kind of learned to write poetry amongst this writing group where everyone was 5-6 years older than he was, and they all seemed pretty shocked that he kind of went this route. Not because of his politics, but I think just because of his personality, being the kind of quieter, younger person in the group. and there's a recounting of the day that he died and his funeral. He was hit. There were two of them that were in some kind of position in some building. I don't understand war language, but the building they were in was hit by an RPG, and him and his friend were both severely injured. And he insisted that his friend be taken. They didn't have an ambulance even. It was just like this kind of broken down Jeep. It would only fit one person, and he insisted the other person get taken first. And so he had to suffer from his injuries for a bit longer, and I think that's part of why he died. If he had, been the first one to get rescued, he might have lived. So it's very complicated. It's hard to answer in a small space. Sorry, but there is that book. We'll have a forward where I kind of talk about that a bit more. But I think the big part of it really is his youth and just the audacity to attempt to do something like that. And again, a lot of the work was unpublished. He had a little chapbook that was published. I think it was published while he was still alive, but the bulk of his work was not. So it's hard to say kind of what he had to do or anything like that.
Yeah, your question kind of touched upon what I was wondering. If you're translating someone who's a living author, like to what extent, what's that relationship like? Like to what extent are you turning to them? And if you were not, I guess what are your resources that you go to when you get stuck on something?
Feel free to answer first.
I don't actually do it. I work with a lot of translators who do work with living authors, and almost always they confer and actually get the author to sort of sign off on the translation. I mean, a lot of this, though, is because only English speakers are monolingual. Okay, everybody else in the world speaks a little bit, and so it's like, I know a little Spanish, but I could never, translate something literary into Spanish. But if somebody were to translate me into Spanish, I could look at it and I could at least, kind of hear it and feel the rhythm of it and know enough to ask a question. And I actually deal with a lot of poet-translator pairs that I kind of speak to both of them at once when I'm preparing a publication. So I think if possible, this is something that's desirable. Now, in the sort of Madison Avenue big publishing world, this is not the case. This is like, they just kind of farm out the translations. A lot of times the translator's not even named. That's less common nowadays, but it used to be quite common that the translator would not even get any sort of credit. They would just get paid a fee. But that's the major press novel world. That's how that works. In my world, it's very different.
Yeah, I would, to add to that, or at least in my experience, it fluctuates pretty wildly. It depends, I think, a lot on where that writer is in their stage, like a young writer or an older established writer. I very deliberately seek out who I think are my peers. Like the book that I had with Scoot and Dive, Ohio Lopez, she's a Guatemalan poet. She had just had her first book published, and I had just had my first book published, so that was like the kind of person I was seeking out. So they tend to just be excited, they're just like, oh, this is awesome, and they'll kind of look through it. And we have some back and forth, but it is quite different from translating someone who has been translated before, has some kind of position of power, whatever that might be. But also I've had my stuff, my last two books have been published bilingually, so I've been translated to Spanish. And it's pretty awesome. I think it helps being a translator because I don't bother them. I just like show me, when it's done and we can have it back and forth. But I don't interfere in the process because I wouldn't want somebody to do that to me. But it's exciting. There were some of the poems where I was like, wait, this is better in Spanish. What's going on here? And so that's been particularly exciting. So I think because I'm also translating into Spanish, I kind of can see it from both perspectives. But it does, the person's age, how much they've published, and just kind of their personality can be a huge factor. Because I reached out to another guy, very similar, Haitian, but ended up moving to the Dominican Republic and writing in Spanish. And it was his first book, and when I reached out, he was asking me questions about the royalties and stuff. And I was like, oh no, this is not, I'm not sure this is going to work out. So there's no consistency. I think is what we're getting at.
Hernan is still alive and has been very sweet, and I've enjoyed the confidence, but there has not been a lot of back and forth. So I've been able to do it, but it's been not as much back and forth. So it's definitely a case of like an older, more established writer given with your experience. But no, right, they can have.
Oh yeah, that's good. No, this guy he's not established either. I was like, man, you don't. I'm not sure you know where this is going.
Yeah, I'm always been fascinated with the foreign poets whom I publish who are just wondering how much money they're going to make on the project. I always have to tell them it doesn't work that way in America. Yeah. There might be money involved in Europe, but over here, no. Only prestige. Anybody else? Well, thank you all for hanging out with us.